Welcome to the first of our book talks for the spring semester of 2021. Before we get started, I want to just announce a few things that are coming up. A week from Friday at 4 o'clock on January 29th, Anthony Tria will be speaking on the last great pandemic, the so-called Spanish flu in Spain. Now, you may be wondering why we're doing it at 4 o'clock on a Friday afternoon. Dr. Tria is extremely busy right now. First of all, he's in Barcelona, so there's a time difference, and he's also extremely busy as one of the leading figures fighting the current pandemic in the area. So that's when we could schedule it, but I hope you can join us. And then 3 weeks from tonight, on Wednesday, February 10th at 8, Heather Dyack will be speaking on her book, which is, Documents of Doubt, the Photographic Conditions of Conceptual Art. You can check all of this on our website, and that will appear in the chat. I'll also note that we've been changed up our system of communication a little bit. We're going to now be doing a weekly newsletter for most of you to help you catch up with our events. Hopefully that'll cut down the emails a little bit. Just to turn to a couple of technical aspects. If you want to ask a question at any point, you can type in your question in the Q&A, and then at the end of the talk, I'll be asking them of the speaker. The last technical thing is that you can also find a link to purchase the book, again in chat. And so now I'll turn it over to Professor Pam Geller of Anthropology to introduce today's speaker.
Thank you so much, Hugh. So it is so lovely to provide the introduction to this book talk, especially on such an auspicious day. There are many wonderful things I could say about Claire. As the acting director of the Gender and Sexuality Studies program, she pulls together resources and organizes events that are of great value to the UN community. As a professor, she stirs an interest in gender and sexuality among the initially ambivalent undergrad, and she fosters a deeper concentration for those students already intrigued. As an anthropologist, Claire details the everyday to tease out the complexities of intersectional social identities and structural inequities. As a writer, she communicates this knowledge in a way that is accessible and engaging. In her book, Gender, Textile Work, and Tunisian Women's Liberation, we see the convergence of all of these admirable traits of Claire's commitment to feminism, pedagogy, and anthropology. From my reading of her book, this research began from a deeply personal place, from conversations shared with her Tunisian in-laws backstage while doing housework or preparing for visitors. Casual observations in the family home morphed into more formal ethnographic chronicling, and Claire traveled into the public bathhouse and then the textile factory. These spaces and the men and women who flowed through them, defined not just by their gender, but also their class, their sexuality, their age, marital status, and nationality, provide informative about the dynamics and contradictions of women's liberation and labor in Tunisia. Throughout her book, and to address the paradox at work in feminist anthropology, which is a commitment to respecting cultural differences and gender equality as a universal human right, Claire makes transparent her own subject position as a Western feminist, as an American married to a Tunisian man, and as a working mother. Claire's ethnographic insights are many. Women may enjoy freedoms under Tunisian law, but the economic realities of their reproductive and productive labor indicate how they are disenfranchised by gender norms. These norms are maintained and made to appear as natural by men and women as they seek to realize or police the ideals of emphasized femininity. Hegemonic masculinity clearly disadvantages women, but it can also disadvantage men, particularly working class or impoverished men. Gender transgression occurs in the form of the regela, a female who performs masculinity occasionally, but more often permanently, as evidenced by the individuals Claire encountered at the textile factory. And in her postscript, she alludes to the changes in Tunisia following the revolution and fall of the dictator Zain El Abidine Ben Ali. Now, a decade later, Tunisians may have free speech and elections, but political dysfunction and joblessness have also intensified. So it seems that there is much future work for Claire to embark on, an examination of gender dimensions of labor and liberation in post-revolutionary Tunisia, perhaps. While we learn of the specifics of Tunisian culture, there are lessons we take away from Claire's book about the more general. Were we to view Tunisian and American sex-gender systems as a Venn diagram, the challenges faced by working mothers might occupy the section where circles overlap. In her introduction, Claire writes, and I paraphrase, that the discourse of the already liberated women, which circulates in Tunisia, obfuscates the unequal gender division of household labor. I was particularly struck by this observation because it calls to mind the gender disparities that we are currently witnessing in the United States. Much of the pandemic's impact on socioeconomic organization has yet to be fully understood, but we do know that it has been disastrous for American women's participation in the workforce, especially women of color, and it will have long-term repercussions. And just to give you some scale of the problem, mothers are 3 times more likely than fathers to have lost jobs during the pandemic. Of the burdens women take on when choice is constrained, Claire's sister-in-law Kalthum's words resonate. It is my pleasure and obligation, she says. So it would seem that the incompatibility between working and caregiving, which unduly falls on mothers, transcends national borders and cultural systems. So with this in mind, I see Claire's book as good to think with, as a conceptual tool for helping us understand our present day conditions, identifying the contradictions at work, realizing modes of resistance, and proposing solutions to move forward. And on that note about the broader applicability of her ideas, I turn the metaphoric microphone over to Claire.
Thank you, Pamela, for that kind introduction, and thanks to everyone for being here, especially on this extraordinary inauguration night. And thank you to Hugh Thomas, Director of the Center for the Humanities, and Megan Homer, the Assistant Director, and also to Books and Books for hosting these events. I wrote this book about research I did on work and gender centered in the Tunisian port city of Binzart, which has a large export factory zone that was built by the regime of Zine Ben Ali in the early 1990s. And he is the dictator who was deposed in the so-called Arab Spring. This book was published in December of 2019 by Palgrave Macmillan. My interest in export factory zones began before I knew much about Tunisia. In graduate school, I became interested in how local communities where export factory zones had come to be were impacted, especially in terms of gender. Most of the existing export factory research took place during the rapid increase in global factory production during the 1980s and 90s. And it rarely focused on the Middle East and North Africa region. And I'll just call it the MENA region from now on. It also focused on gender and class, but rarely focused on gender queerness, other than one study I found, one really important study I found on female masculinity among workers in Egypt. So I'm going to share my screen at this point. So there's a map of the Mediterranean. When I first started to learn about factory zones and started thinking about Tunisia, I wasn't sure that I could find it on a map, but there it is between Algeria and Libya, and very, very close to southern Italy, and with several deep water ports that have been of interest in trade across nationalities for thousands and thousands of years. I conducted the research for this book. Oh, hold on, I'll put this back on the map for now. I conducted this research in 2008 and 2009 in what turned out to be the pre-revolutionary period. Of course, I didn't know that at the time. My interest in conducting research in Tunisia, beyond the personal interest I had as a person married to a Tunisian man, grew from the conflicting things I read and heard about this small Mediterranean country. I read that Tunisia was the exception. It was a progressive country in the so-called Muslim Arab world. I also read that it was an economic success story among African countries, where the IMF and the World Bank's loans had been successful and structural readjustment had been very functional. But then I also read about Tunisia's fast-tracked economic neoliberalization and how it had resulted in brutal price hikes and currency devaluations that were devastating to the working and lower classes. I also read dire reports of human rights abuses and descriptions of Tunisia, as Nouri Ghana described it under the Ben Ali regime, as one large surveillance state. And the most remarkable thing that I read about Tunisia and kept reading and hearing about Tunisia was that it was a very progressive place for women, where archaic interpretations of religious law had been replaced with progressive ones, and where women had been emancipated through gender law codes that had been enacted decades earlier in 1958, as is commemorated by this Tunisian stamp. Right, and it's a little bit hard to read the writing at the bottom that's in French, but it's basically saying this is the celebration of the emancipation of the Tunisian woman. As I would soon find out once I started to live in Tunisia and do research on women in Tunisia, Tunisians are often quick to explain that women are already liberated in Tunisia, and that I need not do this research since the personal status code laws had already afforded women their rights. My Tunisian in-laws were enthusiastic about me coming to Tunisia with my then toddler to live in Tunisia and do research. And indeed, they sent my unmarried sister-in-law to be my companion for the duration of the field work. Kelthum, who's pictured here, and my son Ferris, who's in the stroller, were constant companions. And we lived together and shared an apartment. And Kelthum was actually instrumental in finding a decent apartment and just helped me in more ways I could ever even express. And we went on many strolls in the evening out through the city of Binzart. So we would leave our apartment and we would head downtown, and then we would often head down toward the walkway along the beach called the Corniche that overlooked the Mediterranean. And before we head into the factory where I did this research, it's important to consider that I came into the field as an in-law to a Tunisian family with a toddler. My toddler seemed to enter the terrible twos just as our plane landed in Tunis for the start of my field research. My imagined way of doing this research, or sort of like the fantasy I had, that was it was very different than what ended up transpiring when I was in the field. And I think that's pretty common for, you know, a lot of cultural anthropologists doing field ethnography, that it's not really how they imagine it would be. But I imagine conducting research as a lone and intrepid ethnographer with lots of time on my hands to deep hang out, as Clifford Geertz called it, with people and spend quiet evenings typing up field notes and thinking. But instead I had to learn to weave this ethnography together with the considerable needs of a toddler. And it prompted me to realize that the labor that went into planning life and work while doing childcare, and how often this psychological responsibility fell to women. Also, I had my baby in US culture in 2005 at the height of the intensive mothering movement. And I had been enculturated in parenting groups and natural birth groups that purported that mother and baby should ideally never be apart, where a whole series of practices, which can be really great practices in lots of ways, but included things like that you were supposed to like wear your baby kind of in a wrap or a sling and not put them in a stroller, co-sleeping, breastfeeding on demand for as long as the baby wanted, were emblems of good mothering. And so having to conduct research while dealing with tantrums, and innovating ways to entertain a toddler meant that the stroller walks through Binzart and many trips to the playground where my son would run off some energy became really vital sources of weaving together research and the everyday needs of taking care of a young child. So with this alteration of what I had in my mind as authentic ethnographic research to include mothering, rather than seeing mothering as sort of an outside burden that had no place in the research, came new opportunities for consideration. So this is a for pay playground that overlooks the Mediterranean and had really great fencing, which you really appreciate when you have a toddler that thinks it's fun to run away from you all the time. So at the playground while Ferris played, Kelthum and I talked to and did interviews with many mothers who were sitting on the benches at the edges of the fence. So outside of the photo, there were like rows and rows of mothers sitting together, talking, and other women too. So it doesn't include them because, taking photos could be a bit sensitive, especially with people that I hadn't already built a rapport with. So the way that these sort of discussion interviews happened also didn't mesh with my idea of how an interview was supposed to go, right? So my ideal of an interview was there were no disruptions, right? And everyone's fine with you recording it, which nobody was okay with that. And the recording device I bought was like useless, right? And I might as well have saved my money because nobody was okay with that. And there were sort of constant disruptions. And I found that this was true in particular in doing interviews with mothers, is that they were, they didn't really have a kind of a sense of a time when they shouldn't be disrupted by the work of motherhood and all the care that went into that. So I had to get used to what some ethnographers now are discussing as a kind of fragmentation in the research process that often felt very unsettling to me because there are a few really great ethnographies that deal with being a parent and a mother in the field. But oftentimes in my ethnographic field training courses, motherhood wasn't necessarily really a focus. So the stroller walks became really important as a way to get a feel for the city. And there were women out about everywhere. And there were many outdoor markets. So I'm going to change the slide and show two photos that I took of these outdoor marketplaces. These were flooded with women who were doing shopping for goods and clothing in an economy that had been battered by a decade of currency devaluation. These women were, and there's lots of theorization about this, that women in the developing world who are working class are really the primary absorbers of the shocks of economic neoliberalization because they're the primary marketers, right? So you see some men there, the men are the ones running the tables, right, who own them. And women disproportionately are the ones having to do that household budgeting. So other things that I noticed as we took our long walks through Binzart early on was a billboard, an advertisement billboard. The image of the woman model on this billboard for Manpower, which is at the time was the largest temp agency in the world, led me to some questions. The woman in the image wasn't dressed like most of the Tunisian women I saw around me. Nor was her jaunty masculine pose like most women's habitus. Beyond the obvious irony that the company is named Manpower, but most temps are women, the image also seemed to be meant to appeal to women who saw it. So what was the appeal to women who passed by this billboard of a woman with short hair, little makeup, and androgynous clothing, and a jaunty, self-confident look on her face? Later, when I gained entry into the factory where I conducted research, I would find some women with a similar habitus, and I'll get to them a bit later. While I broke the intensive mothering rule by strollering my baby rather than wearing him in a sling around Binzart, I also had to find a daycare for him so that I could research in the factory zone where a baby just, really wouldn't, there's no way that you could really bring a baby into a factory zone like that. As many parents know, there is a particular heartbreak to dropping off one's baby at a daycare. This was certainly what I felt as I left mine at the Binzart daycare, despite the warm reassurances of the women who worked there. The image of my son crying after me at the window, looking out of the daycare as I went away in a taxi, followed me into the factory and taunted me while I tried to do field notes. The kindness of Tunisians helped me through these feelings. Each morning when I arrived at the factory, women workers would ask me, "How's Ferris?" And we would engage in quick chats about our respective families' babies, which helped me to settle into writing field notes. And although I couldn't take photos inside the factory, it was very hard to get the paperwork signed off by the government to go into the factory zone, because it really is, a zone with gates and men with guns, and you have to show your paperwork to get in. I did take photos right outside the factory zone. So on the right side of your screen, you can see two women who've just gotten off a microbus, who are wearing headscarves, and they're going in to work a shift in the factory there. And they're just sort of walking across a parking lot to get to one of the gated entryway points there. The factory where I did research, I gave the pseudonym Z Textiles. And it's a fabric cutting factory in this zone. And in it, industrial sized bolts of fabric are delivered from trucks that are loaded from ships at the docks of Binzart's deep water port, right? So they're coming across the Mediterranean from other countries with the fabric. The spools are unloaded at the factory by young men workers who deliver them to the forbidding halls of fabric shelves. Or at least they were forbidden to me because they were a very dark, very not well lit, homosocial, masculine area of the factory. And sometimes the fabric itself, the bolts, would be carried directly to women's tables. At the fabric cutting tables, young women who are called girls in Arabic, because if you're unmarried in Tunisian, you're a woman, you're called a girl. Their job is to pull down the fabric and pin patterns to layers of the fabric, cut it out, fold it, box it, and at which point the boxes will be reloaded onto a truck by the men to deliver to another factory in the zone to be sewn by another group of young women. The women's work pinning and cutting out patterns is both high pressure and tedious. They usually work in teams of two, pulling down fabric layer after layer down the long tables. Then they pin a pattern down on top of the stack of fabric, and this requires climbing on the table and crawling around with pins carried in their mouths, which is, by the way, a common thing that you often see people who sew do, is to carry the pins in their mouths. Then they must saw around the pattern with a special cutting saw that hangs from an electrical grid attached from the ceiling. Z Textiles, like so many of the world's global production zones, is a gender stratified and sexualized workplace. Women work on the fabric cutting table, standing on their feet for full day shifts. Technically, they can ask their supervisor to take breaks, but at the risk of being shamed and missing their quotas. Men work on the loading dock and in the dark fabric shelves. Men do inventory and don't have quotas. They get many breaks and get to sit often. While the manager, who tends to give commands and sharp reprimands to women workers, he hangs out to take smoke breaks with the men workers and has a convivial relationship with them, despite the class chasm between them, or maybe it's because of that class chasm. Sexualization in global factories is well documented in the research literature and takes a variety of cultural forms. So one of the most notorious cases of this sexualization was in the factories in Juarez in Mexico's northern corridor, where US male managers were organizing bikini contests for the female workers called like the Miss Juarez, swimsuit contests and things like that. So there are varied cultural forms of this. Tunisian women tend to thwart men's ability to gaze at them outside of consenting intimate relationships in society. Comprehending the bravado Tunisian women have about denying men's eyes in public spaces was confusing to me at first. In the early days of my research, I was taking a stroll with my sister-in-law, Kalthoum, and my son in his stroller. Our pleasant walk through the downtown streets was being disrupted by Kalthoum's steering of my son's stroller and me off the sidewalk and down into the car traffic whenever we neared cafes. To note, most cafes in Tunisia are men's homosocial zones. After this happened several times, my heart racing from the fear of taking my baby down into the busy road, I asked Kalthoum why we couldn't stay on the sidewalk and walk by the men in the cafes. Her immediate answer was, "It isn't done." Later in conversation, and we had many late night conversations and sometimes, very good-natured arguments, she explained that women mustn't walk in front of men and that only a bad woman would do such a thing. She said this with a great deal of pride. Over the following weeks of being out in the city, I observed women stepping down off sidewalks as they approached men's cafes, intrepidly walking into the road, heads held high. As workers in Z Textile's factory, women's ability to deny men's gaze was thwarted by the manager's office window. His office window was made of one-way mirrored glass and faced out onto the factory floor into the women's area. The areas of the factory where men workers do their tasks, the fabric shelves and the loading dock, are not visible from the manager's office window. This meant that the manager and any men he invited into his office, which he did often, could watch the women workers without the women being able to see them. Intermittently, the manager would come striding out of the office to confront a woman worker after he saw her through his window making a mistake or breaking a rule. For example, women often hid Coca-Cola bottles under their tables and pretended to drop something so they could reach down and take a sip, since the policy was for very long shifts of standing, they couldn't have anything to drink, not even water. So it's sort of like one of those rules that's just made to be broken. The manager would usually choose not to fire women when he caught them, but to confront them. What he did do was wield the fact that he had evidence on a woman to motivate her to work harder for fear she might be fired. This management tactic seemed to have the desired impact of pressuring up the pace of the women's work. The manager told me that he had to keep his eye on the women in the way a parent might talk to sneaky children. And I questioned this. I asked him many times, could we sit down and do an interview? And his response would be to sort of brusquely say, well, what do you want to ask me? Just ask me right now. So, at a certain point when I'd been in the field for a while, I asked him, why certain, women had to stay in a really boring folding job that happened to be closest to his one-way mirrored glass. And I'd noticed that these women tended to be the most scantily clad and sort of conventionally pretty. And they were sort of closest to his window. And, he said he needed to watch them closely because he wasn't sure about their minds yet, like if they were intelligent enough. So the women's job is stressful because they're expected to meet the high quotas and they have very strict deadlines. And added to the pressures that women must rely upon the men workers to carry the large bolts of fabric from those fabric shelves to them to be placed on the spools on the women's tables. The men did not simply carry over a bolt of fabric when asked often. Rather, they could coerce the women into flirtations or interactions. Girls who cajoled the young men or gave them smiles or a sweet word could sometimes get the fabric bolt delivered more quickly. Those girls who refused to play this game risked having their request ignored by the men, running out of fabric, falling behind in their quotas. And there was a very high turnover, which again is a part of a global trend in production that people sort of come and go very quickly, or people are fired and hired very quickly. So there were a lot of reasons for this to be stressful. At this point, I'd like to say that while much of what I described thus far sounds quite dismal, it's also true that working in the factory can open opportunities for women, and that this is often fun. And that these are mostly young people, like people who are, high school age, or just, maybe a college undergrad age. Several young women were able to use their factory earnings as an opportunity to save a dowry and negotiate a marriage with a man they wanted, or conversely, to put off a marriage. The factory, with all its pressures and humiliations, could offer young women freedom to be away from family, out of the house, and away from the peering eyes of the neighborhood, where gossip can be a real policing agent for girls in particular. At home, unmarried women are also expected to do unwaged labor with their mothers, and usually have their movements limited. So in the building where I lived, we would sit sometimes up on the roof, and one of the adolescent daughters of the girl who lived, the adolescent daughter who lived below us, would come and sit on the roof with us sometimes. And she would complain about being fed up because through the whole summer break, her father forbade her from going down to the beach, which was, really just a few blocks away. That she really needed to stay in the house most of the time helping her mother. So the factory can offer opportunities here too. The workday at the factory offers a kind of intrigue for many young workers, with joking and teasing and singing of spontaneous poems to one another, and gossiping and romance all swirling around on the factory. They would kind of design special poems that could just be said sort of like a drive-by as they're walking past someone without slowing down production. And most of all, the factory is a field of opportunity for challenging and playing around with gender itself. I mean, and when I say most of all, I mean that what struck me was how much playing around with gender there was. And that included men playing around with gender, but also women doing so in a way that was a bit more confrontational. Of central importance to the exploitation of workers in the factory is the maintenance of the gender binary and masculine supremacy. So class could be obfuscated between the bourgeois manager and the men workers through their joking sessions and smoking sessions. The gender binary is subject to far more policing, yet certain women workers are masculine, and their efficacy at invading the zones of men and their work threaten the gender supremacy system upon which the exploitation of workers is based. So now moving back to what might be compelling about the image of the model on the Men Power billboard. Girls and women in Tunisia who are masculine are perhaps best understood to be what Sarah Ahmed calls familiar strangers. There's a normative word for a masculine girl or woman, a rajala. It can be used as an adjective or a noun, and it's almost always positive. So if a girl or a woman does something that seems really brave, she might be kind of complimented by saying, "Oh, you're a rajala." Or you can be living your life in a somewhat consistent way as rajala. Most of the rajala in the textiles factory are relatively permanent, although I did see photos from a wedding where a young woman who was rajala at the factory was all done up in makeup, and I didn't even recognize her in the wedding photo, to her delight. They typically wear their brother's Levi's and plain white t-shirts. They tend to keep their hair pulled back in ponytails and use no makeup. They're so normative that at first I did not consider the subversiveness of what the rajala were being and doing at work. And this also concerned me because of the fear of a kind of erasure that can happen around gender subversion, and particularly when it's women doing it. So the Rogella are adored by the other factory women. They're chivalrous, helpful, and flirtatious with women. Women are free to be flirtatious with Rogella, often exchanging spoken word poems with them in passing. Women call out to them and even pinch them on their arms and backs and as they pass by, giggling. The Rogella's relationship to men's workers is more challenging. The Rogellas seize opportunities to help with men's work, and they tend to be good at it. Sometimes the managers even call on a Rogella over a man to help with a man's task, or with a masculine task, I should say. When they can, the Rogella swagger back into the men's fabric shelves themselves, climb up on the shelving, and retrieve bolts of fabric. The men workers' response to the Rogella is to tease them. If a Rogella carries a bolt of fabric herself, a man worker is likely to shout out, "Thank you, brother." The manly woman will be quick to clap back with, "You're welcome, brother. Let me know anytime you need my help." Thus, when girls have trouble convincing the men workers to get a bolt for them, they may have the opportunity to ask a manly woman to get the bolt for them, thus bypassing the coerced flirtations exacted by the men. Observing the Rogellas in action, subverting the gender binary, often delighted me. Their masculinity is important in that it challenges the notion that men be paid more because their work is more difficult. So the women's work in the factory was often described by the term light, and men's work was often described as heavy, even though women were doing all these very athletic things at work. Rogellas also engage in romances with women, challenging heteronormativity, albeit as they grow older, many will likely be pressured into marriages with men. Rogella's lack of interest in getting married to a man challenges the social anxiety, which is really at an all-time high in Tunisia, around this growing number of Tunisian women who are remaining unmarried, who are described with a word that's like spinster that translates to withered branch. The Rogella offer an alternative pathway to independence, albeit the family will have expectations of them to continue to live at home throughout their lives and to perform a great deal of unwaged labor at home along with their waged labor. The female empowerment narrative for understanding the Rogella is seductive, but problematic. While masculine girls challenge the naturalness of men's dominance at work, which is very useful, female masculinity itself does not subvert the low status of feminized work. Profit is made through the low value placed on feminized labor, including that performed by Rogellas. Further, the Rogellas can increase production by doing both the women's job and the men's. Men workers increase their work pace to protect themselves from barbed jokes about needing a Rogella to help them do their work. So having said all this, that doesn't mean that what the Rogellas are doing and what gender subversion can do isn't still a challenge and isn't productive. And to note, the problem of gendered exploitation in global, production zones hasn't been solved yet by anyone. But the point is the productivity of the challenge itself, and the sort of challenge to the essential. The essential nature of masculine supremacy itself. So in the interest of time, I just wanted to note that we've just passed the 10-year anniversary of the toppling of the Ben Ali regime in Tunisia, so the start of the Arab Spring. And as we speak, protests are ensuing in Tunisia over economic injustices. Many of the protesters are young men, as was the case 10 years ago, when young men from economically disadvantaged backgrounds were, doing things like self-immolating in protest of the lack of opportunity and also the kind of cronyism and corruption of the Tunisian political economic system. So this reality evokes Nouri Ghana's discussion of the Tunisian Revolution for Freedom and Dignity, as many prefer to call it, as an ongoing movement rather than a finished accomplishment. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thanks much. So if people would like to start sending in your questions, we could get the question and answer section of it going. And I think I'll start by mentioning something Pamela said about your awareness of your positionality. And could you tell us a little bit about how Tunisian workers reacted to you and the fact that you're this American coming in to study Tunisia?
It was, I had to stay for a really long time before there was much trust there. So people's first initial thoughts were that I either worked for the European contractors, like that I worked for Volkswagen or, one of the other big corporations that was having their stuff made in the factory, and that I was watching them to see if they were good workers. And also suspicion that I might be working for the CIA because I was American. And that's, unfortunately, that's a suspicion that's sort of not that paranoid, right? Because that does happen a lot. So, motherhood was a big part of getting beyond that too, right? That them seeing me around Binzart with a toddler and having, to deal with a lot of the stuff that mothers have to deal with help sort of, I think, soften their kind of image of me. And also that I'm this sort of awkward, klutzy person who was around the edges, of the factory, getting in the way, and stuff like that. And that I probably just didn't seem very, threatening just in my own habitus either. And of course, then one of the big things was once they knew I was married to a Tunisian man, right? That alters their sense of me as an American in certain ways. So I felt like I had to keep being cognizant myself, though, of what it meant to have the kind of, or to kind of be able to wield the kind of power that I had, even unintentionally, right? That I think that takes a lot of, you have to do a lot of reflection in your field notes, and just as you're processing, what you're seeing, especially when you go through times where you're feeling frustrated about things that are going on, or especially around these assumptions of the natural differences between men and women.
So the next question comes from Hema, who first says, congratulations on an excellent talk. Then says, I have a question about whether the masculine woman, Rajelas, identified as what we would call gay in the US. Did you ever discuss that with them?
I didn't hear them or, talk with them about, identifying with the term gay in the US or lesbian for that matter. And that doesn't mean maybe they weren't just not around me, because I was with them mostly in the factory. And it seems like the Rajela were kind of towing a line between being very subversive in a gendered sense, but also having a very accepted kind of familiar place in Tunisian society, where there are daughters and sisters and families who, are doing and being very masculine and are kind of loved and adored for doing it. And that if they were to express sort of overtly, a sexuality outside of heteronormativity, that might push them into a very different kind of category of understanding too. But I also just don't think that like women's lesbianism is necessarily taken very seriously. My sense, and I mean, obviously this is heavily classed too, but my sense was that it just sort of wasn't on the radar to take seriously the idea of women having a serious sort of romantic relationship with each other. And at the same time, women are, holding hands and hugging and very physically affectionate with each other and, engaging in all this flirtation with Rajela.
And next question comes from Sean Black, who says it's an exceptional and fascinating talk. Then asked, is there a male femininity equivalent?
Yes, Sean, for sure. There are men who are called kind of like lady men, and there's like a lot of joking about their position in society, and a lot of men who fall into the category of a sort of a feminine man maintain their status because they, they're very much still part of the sort of ritual status of being a man, like getting in a heterosexual marriage, for example. But at the same time, they may be sort of gossiped about or laughed about behind their backs. But they're not ostracized. But if we were to kind of apply what Hema's question was to them, if there was any suspicion of them kind of being, taking on a gay identity, then that's like kind of a whole different story. So I knew women who were like married and engaged to men who I was sort of like, oh, they seemed extremely feminine, and I kind of wanted to ask questions about that, and everyone was sort of like, no, it's that's just totally fine, and he's just kind of a lady man, and maybe they would laugh about it. But it was the fact of being in the heterosexual marriage and being able to do that sort of protect men like that, feminine men. But law in Tunisia is still that it is illegal to be gay, and old French legal practices are still, torturous practices are still done to a man who's suspected of being gay, who's picked up by the police, right? So that's happening simultaneously.
Okay, thanks. And Bonnie Rigg asks, how long would they generally work in the factory? I assume that's workers in general.
Yeah, that's another question I really dealt with, is most wouldn't last in the factory beyond really like mid 30s would be like the highest time that they would last in the factory. And part of that is, that the management like to hire younger women and really even teenage girls because of a lot of reasons. They think they're kind of easier to push around maybe, which may or may not be true, but also that they're less likely to, complain. And there's this very high turnover rate. And the other reason is that it's hard to be married and stay in the job because there'll be a kind of pressuring, usually from the woman's family or the in-laws, for her to stop working or to assume that her job was just to build up a dowry so she could get married in the first place. And there are no protections for like a pregnant woman in the workplace. There was one pregnant woman while I was doing research there, and she would ask to sit down and be denied, and just told, if she wanted to sit down, she should just be fired right now and go home. So she had to make that choice. So it's not a place where any of the protections that Tunisia has in law apply, and that's very typical for these export factory zones, where unions, other kinds of attention to workers' rights are just, they just don't exist in those zones, which is sometimes why they're called offshore production too. Did I totally answer your question though? So yeah, so there was one woman in her upper 30s who stayed on, and that's because she was chosen by the male manager for this special position, which was to manage the women. And her job was to go around and kind of be this tough aunt kind of figure to these girls and sort of shame them and wag her finger at them and watch them closely and carefully.
Thanks. Emily Powell asks, what did it mean for you to adopt to the behaviors the Tunisian women follow, for example, avoiding men on the street?
Oh, Emily, yeah, I know that's a really interesting question that sometimes comes up in the class on the Middle East that I teach too. Is at first I was really deep in the throes of culture shock, and I just felt really angry and frustrated and all the feelings that one tends to feel in those moments of culture shock. I had to deal with my own sort of arrogance as an American, around that, and this sort of attitude of, well, those men should just not look, and that's not my problem, and that kind of attitude. And I think it's a very humbling experience to when you're really in a situation like that. And there was one time when I thought, I'm just going to march right past those men, and I'm not going to walk down in the street. And at the last minute, I couldn't do it. I got really close, and then I went down in the street. But that was a really important moment too, in thinking about how these Tunisian women tend to to think about pride and dignity for women too.
Thanks. Sharon Watson asks, this is an exceptional work on so many levels. As you have gone, well, she says that, then she asks, as you have gone through your career in anthropology, how has your positionality as a mother ethnographer been accepted? Have you seen changes in curriculum or in the field that take into better consideration the time, effort, and constraints of mother ethnographers in foreign field sites?
Sharon, I'm not sure about that. I would love to see more written from the perspective of mothers doing anthropology and field work. There are some volumes, but I think there's not nearly enough attention, and especially since now, and really since Sharon and I were in graduate school together, by the way, that as we know, there are many women in anthropology now, that some of the issues that just didn't seem to come up for men who had male privilege out in the field now really do need to be contended with more, right? So I would have to say, sadly, I don't think there's nearly enough focus on what it means to mother while doing field research. So, yeah.
Okay, the next question comes from Meg, who asks, there seems to be an interesting tension between deference, submission, and pride, such as when you saw a woman move off the sidewalk yet holding their heads high with pride. Do you have any additional thoughts on this dynamic?
I do. It really helped Laila Abu-Lughod. If you haven't read her, Veiled Sentiments and Writing Women's Worlds, beautiful ethnographies, and about Egyptian Bedouin women mostly, but she has this really great understanding of how it's women's choice to be deferential that can be a way of wielding power, right, within a system, and that women can gain status even within, as they're navigating a system that really ultimately reinforces certain men's, not all men's, but certain men's kind of dominance, right, in a quote unquote patriarchal society. And I know patriarchy is a problematic concept, but in a society that would be considered sort of more masculine dominated. So I think it's the power resting in the choice, and the way that the choice is constructed as something that women do of their own volition, and that's something that's like that women learn amongst one another, right? And that's, that can be something like avoiding men's eyes, or avoiding sounds to me very passive. It's much more like I'm denying men the access to me, and that's a much more sort of active stance. And part of this is really trying to resist the way we think about like Muslim women and Middle Eastern women, I think, as these sort of victims of patriarchal society and of these atavistic men, right? And then we ended up with these very flattened, really sexist portraits of men too, when we do that, rather than seeing men and women as in a kind of a dialectical around their relationships with power within family.
So our next question and comment comes from Steve Butterman, and I have to read this exactly. Thank you for this excellent talk, Claire, and congratulations on your beautiful book. Can you give us a hint on what's next for your research, research-wise? P.S. You rock.
Thank you so much, Steve. I mean, I'm definitely, very interested in this, and studying further unwaged labor that tends to be very, gendered, reproductive labor, the kind of the hidden work that, Hochschild called emotional labor. So I think I'm really headed in the direction of looking at how that kind of work, including a lot of that sort of transmutation of feelings that women are often having to do within their homes and families and in the workplace, impacts their sort of power and status within the waged workforce. So I think I'm still headed in that direction, but I may focus more on the home sphere in the next ethnography too.
Okay, and for what looks like the last question, I'll go back to Meg, who asks or says, I'm curious about how female workers move into the role of a regella. Since there seems to be such heavy policing of gender norms and roles, I wonder how someone is able to stave off some of that policing. Do they have to earn seniority or economic power first?
Meg, I think it's more like what, at least from what I saw, and again, because I was this sort of in a Tunisian family of in-laws, so of course that shaped what I think, I saw there, but that there were like little girls around who seemed to be kind of tacitly encouraged to be Rojella, and that they were, you could be rewarded for being a really pretty girl and being really, emphasizing your femininity and everything. But to be a Rojella had in some ways a similarity to being like a tomboy, in that you could kind of get like a real status bump by being a tomboy. And I think in a lot of US culture, right, you might get teased some, but there's something cool about being like the boys. And that in a lot of households where there's just a great deal of work to do, like most people are, doing their laundry by hand, and that's all women having to do that, and plus having to do, all this other kind of labor in the household, that if you can have a daughter who's Rojella, she can do a lot more labor for you. She can kind of do the things that boys would be doing and that girls would be doing. So, I mean, I don't want to reduce everything to the material, but that there may be a, something that's happening earlier in childhood within the family that encourages, being a Rojella too. And we know this, there's research, like for example, on the Fa'afafine in Samoa, that in some large families, one biological boy is kind of encouraged within families to do women's chores and take on those chores too, and then is highly valued within the family as he becomes a more and more feminine person, because he can do all these this work, the outdoor work that's associated with men on the farms and women in the household.
Well, thanks so much for that fascinating talk, and for the really good, wonderful question and answer period. And so I hope everybody will join me in spirit, if you can't do it on the screen, in applauding and giving you thanks for this. And I hope everybody will come again to join us for future book talks and other events at the center. So much for being with us, and I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone. Thanks you. Thanks, Pamela. That's great.